أَمَّنْ هُوَ قَانِتٌ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ سَاجِدًا وَقَائِمًا يَحْذَرُ الْآخِرَةَ وَيَرْجُو رَحْمَةَ رَبِّهِ قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ إِنَّمَا يَتَذَكَّرُ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على عبد الله ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. We'd like to welcome all of you to this first episode of these Majalis Ilmiyyah, this idea of sitting together and exploring topics that matter to students of knowledge. It's an informal sitting, and with me today I have Sheikh Bakr Al-Khalafi. Sheikh, how are you?
Alhamdulillah.
Hope you're well.
Allah yabarak.
Allah bless you, Sheikh. We're going to be talking today, inshallah ta'ala, about the idea of building a library, about reading, about how to deal with books. And I'm not sure how much of that we'll get through in one session, and we might have to make others as well, inshallah. But I think that all of the students of knowledge, all of the people watching, they appreciate the value of books. But I think we often struggle in terms of how we sort of interact with those books. So you have all kinds of things. I mean, you see people have huge libraries, but never really pick anything out of the shelf. People who never really build a library because they maybe don't know how to do it. You have all of these kind of modern pressures in terms of should it be digital? Should it be physical? What's the value of having physical books? How do I even read? How do I approach a book? And with you yourself now, you are a PhD candidate in Usul Fiqh. I'm sure there's a lot of reading involved in this kind of study. So I really wanted just to sit together and just explore this idea of reading, libraries, books, and how we benefit from them, inshallah ta'ala.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawlahu ba'd. Where I'd actually like to begin is that the collection of books that you have that you can refer to as a Maktabah collectively is somewhat a reflection of your personal identity, and at times even shows the growth that you're going through, your personal transformations and development. And you'll see, inshallah ta'ala, as we'll explore in this sitting anyway, how there'll be books that are meant for the beginner and more suitable to those beginning stages. And then there's things that you might require for research and, more developed and seasoned people. And so it's almost like the mirror that you need to hold up to see yourself in a sense. And so it's nice if you've got those physical books, but even if you don't, you'll be able to see that sort of where you are in life, and it will show, maybe the where the journey has taken you, and as a result of that, what you need to be focusing on. Maybe take a step back and sort of align yourself with the initial journey that you wanted to go on. I think also a part of books, as we'll see inshallah ta'ala, is there's an element of self-discovery. And we'll see that bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala as well. But I think the most important part of books that scares me the most is the intentions behind reading and the intention behind collecting books as well. And it can lead to that element of boasting and just gathering books for the sake of just having the biggest maktabah in
Alhaakum wat-takathur. SubhanAllah, it goes into everything. I think that the idea that we as human beings, we have a love of gathering things, but sometimes it's not done purposefully. And I think if we start maybe with what you suggested with regard to reading itself and the niyyah behind reading. We were talking earlier about a particular element which is taught within the Islamic university in some of the higher education courses with regard to the intention behind which you read. And I think that for me, the way that I always thought about it, just initially to start off the conversation is, and I've spoken about this before, that you certainly have reading that is related to the direct things that you are studying at that particular time. Like if I'm preparing a class on something and I'm going to teach that book, I'm going to read the book, I'm going to read the shuruhat of the book, I'm going to read perhaps some connected topics to it, maybe a research paper on. So I'm sort of being forced to read something which is not, I don't have a lot of choice in. It's kind of being chosen for me by the fact that this is the topic that is going to be taught. Or for a student who's studying, let's say they're in AMAU right now, and they're studying a particular part of the course. So they have a matan they're studying, they have a sharh they're studying, or they have some recommended reading from the teacher. That's sort of one aspect. And that is really that I guess the choices are a little bit more limited. You might choose the taba'a, what print of the book. You might choose whether you need to buy this book. Do I need to buy every sharh of the book or not?
Yeah.
Or do I just need to select some? Books are getting more expensive as well. So it's not like before where perhaps you could have bought a lot of books and then later dealt with it. Maybe when a new version comes out, so the choices there are maybe a bit more limited, and maybe we can start there. And then you talk about things like your maraji', the books you need as a reference point.
Yeah.
And obviously there's books you just want to dive into for reference, just pull off the shelf. And maybe you might read it at some point, but it might not be something you read from beginning to end every day. And then there's this whole other topic of this free reading and, picking things and just having a collection of books that interest you and reflect who you are. So that was how I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
Sheikh, what do you think about this idea of approaching reading and the types of books you read?
So yeah, subhanAllah, again, like you get with most things in life, there's almost like with the initial stages of reading and the first book that you buy, there's this element of taqleed involved. We just have to almost blind follow your teacher. So your teacher just recommends a book and he says, you know what, this sharh would be perfect for this matan that you're currently studying, and maybe that's what you should read, and maybe that's what you should refer back to as additional notes and details that maybe you don't cover in the dars. Because as well, the durus will vary. Your first dars will probably be very sort of simplified, summarized, maybe very generic, a smooth, journey throughout that book. And so that book ends up, becoming your first insight into something a little bit more sophisticated. And in that moment, you'll probably think, oh, this is the biggest book. I've got this really sort of intense book, and you'll always feel that. But as time goes on, you look back at it and you think, oh, that book, yeah, subhanAllah, at that moment I was panicking and reading it, but end up being, it's really sort of light reading in years to come. But there is almost like this element of taqleed involved. And the key there is, I think, in that stage of your life, is that you don't go around grabbing random books from bookshelves. Maybe if you're advised to go and purchase that, and maybe, just to keep, then do so. But that you don't go reading, the free reading, and we'll get to that inshallah ta'ala. But that's where you get things like Ta'amul Kibar, Summul Sigar. So if your sort of level of fiqh allows you to read a simple sharh on a mukhtasar of a fiqh book, don't grab your mughni and just say I'm gonna focus on this and I'm just read and try and absorb that, because the chances are it's going to be really bad for you. You're not going to understand anything from it at all, and so you kind of have to be able to just respect the idea of that the teacher that's teaching you is a specialist and he's been through that journey and that he knows what's good for you. And that's again the whole idea of the bidayat of a person, the beginnings of anybody. There's the element of taqleed. You go to primary school and secondary school, you don't pick your curriculum. It's given to you, and you have to kind of have that, or a similar level, if not a greater level of respect like that to Islamic studies, where you kind of let the system, the institution, your teachers choose the curriculum for you.
So now if we're looking at, let's stay with that student at the beginning of their journey, and they have certain texts, books they're studying, and their teacher recommends for them some other books. The first thing that is going to come, I think, is the selection of, let's say, for example, an explanation of a book. How do we choose? So the teachers recommended, for example, a certain explanation, but you're going to go into the bookshop and see perhaps a whole shelf worth, and you're going to see different taba'at, different prints of the book. I guess at the moment, in that moment, the student is still very much reliant upon what their teacher recommends for them, even down to the print of the book. Which print should I buy? Because that will come from a lot of a person looking at the different prints that are available for a certain book. Some books will be very limited, some will have more. And really, I remember speaking to a brother recently who said, we sat down for a session of mudhakara, and we were going through Fath al-Bari. And he said, until I did that, I never knew really what the best taba'a of Fath al-Bari was. He said, don't get me wrong, I heard the mashayikh recommend, لكن, ليس الخبر كالمعاينة. The person, he said, when I actually went through and each of us had a different copy in our hands and we're going through this book, it became very clear which one was generally the best one to have in terms of the accuracy of the text and things like that. So just for a student in that early phase, teachers recommended you walk into the bookshop, you see all these books here. Are we saying to them, try to stick to what your teacher has recommended in the beginning? How do they approach a book then, that in terms of they're in the bookshop and they're picking these books off the shelf?
The thing is, we live in this very strange time where there is almost like this democracy of knowledge. Like you can access the idea of books and what preferences are in a way that we've never been able to do before in history. And you see that today, and I'm not significantly older than I think most of the students in the academy or even our viewers, but one of the things I've definitely noticed from the time I started the Jamia to like the later generations, which are probably students that are joining now, is that you've got all of these sort of like people that are producing like how you should read books, which is a really good thing. But it's created this idea that, he's suggesting this sort of reading material and that person's suggesting something else. Instead of having like this one person that you're really close to and that knows you on a very personal level and can suggest things to you that are very personalized and good to you. And this was the state of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you think about like how many companions come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and they all say awsini. Every one of the advices of the Prophet ﷺ was, very unique and tailored and different to the other one. To one person it's la taghdab, to another person is bir bi walidayk, and all of these differentiations exist, right? And you kind of have to, with books, you have to respect your teacher enough or the person you're consulting to kind of let them lead you, because there's so much around. There's also the issue of peer pressure. So away from what is suggested by certain teachers, for example, and certain scholars, maybe mashayikh, tulab al-ilm, that suggest like a curriculum in reading that's out there. On top of that, you have the general state of the conversation that occurs amongst tulab al-ilm as well, like your friends and everything, which is a very beautiful thing because it can be motivating. But it can sometimes create an urge within you to go and read something which maybe isn't the best thing for you. And that existed even in my time, to be honest, where you sometimes feel like, oh, he's reading that, so I think I need it too. And you almost have to like have this level of almost like this sabr and to fight the urge, to keep away from it and to listen to the advice of people. Or else if you just keep jumping around, because the advice of people, especially if they're not really professionals, I guess, in building and teaching and actually developing you as a person, that brother that tells you, buy that book, it might be less than 24 hours when he suggests 3 other books that you should read right now, and that always happens. And if you keep jumping around, you're never going to get to a level of knowledge where, because it's not a structured form of learning. And it's that whole parable of like the usfur, right? لا يثبت على شجرة. And because of that, it's just a constant change of, just jumping from one tree to another, and you don't get anywhere with that. من ثبت نبت. I also think, and other mediums as well, that allows you to almost like gain access into the idea of good tab'as, good books, good, sort of reading habits and things like that. Because there's so much out there, it becomes almost like distracting from developing your own sort of, meaningful. Because if you have a vision for yourself and somebody's created a process for you, but that process keeps changing because you're shifting to another one, you're never going to get anywhere. And so you find today people in WhatsApp groups, and there's all these suggestions of like, the most important read that you have to read. You might be, on YouTube watching Sheikh Abdullah Al-Batati, Hafidhahullah, right? And just thinking, that's the book I need to get, or this guy, or whoever else it is. And all of that one of the things you probably need to do is just set yourself a rule and a principle, and just say, look, I'll buy whatever books that I can do financially. Don't be fiscally responsible, as long as you're not putting yourself through hardship. Purchase as many books as you can, especially if they're mufid and it's advised by the mashayikh. But just don't read every one of them. Just focus on one book that you've been advised by your closest teacher and the person that you confide in the most for advice and nasiha, and that knows you on a personal level, and that's where you see real growth, bi'idhnillah.
Beautiful. So now I've got this book that the teacher has advised me, and sometimes I might have bought. It's interesting. I find like when it comes to buying books, you really have two methodologies that are diametrically opposite to each other. You have some people who will buy as many books as they can, even if they don't read them. And some people are very like selective, like I'll buy the book that I'm going to read. I think I was like that for a long time. I felt like I would buy a book because I some of them are large. I would buy it to put it on the shelf, but generally I would buy a book because I'm going to read that book. And I think both of them work as long as you don't read what is not on your reading list at that time. Both of them work. The interesting thing comes actually when you get this issue of taba'at, new prints coming out, and it kind of pains you that you put a book on the shelf.
Yeah.
And then later on, the peer pressure comes that you really should have bought this other print of the book. And then you're kind of like, I haven't even read this one yet. So that comes there. But let's talk about the student who brings a book in their hands. First things you do with a book. So for me personally, I think that there are some things that you should not put your book on the shelf unless you've done it. Especially when you have books that you don't, you have a book on your shelf, you have no idea what that book has got in it. I think for me, index, contents page, at least have a look through the book and have a look at the masail that are in it, have a look at the structure, maybe the muqaddimah, if it has a muqaddimah, maybe a couple of pages from the inside, so you have an idea. Okay, I kind of have an idea. What do you think about that, Sheikh? What do you do when you first take a book home?
So subhanAllah, I think again, it's probably a stage of development, because definitely it's something I definitely do now, but it definitely wasn't something I was doing at the beginning. So I think maybe if you're starting off reading, because that's what we want all of the brothers and sisters, inshallah ta'ala, to be doing, which is actively reading and actively seeking knowledge, both by attending classes, but also independently learning. One of the key things that if you've never grabbed a book before is just to identify yourself with like key things. Those key things, I think you can probably say 3 to about 5 things, even before like indexes and masail and things like that. And I'll get to why that is, inshallah ta'ala. But the key things are the name of the book, the fen that it's written in. Is it taken from mustal? Is it a mukhtasar, for example? Is it a sharh? Is it this from another book? And so the correlation it has to another book in that science, right? So the second question being the science that it's within, and then its connection to other books within that science. And maybe things like, you can also include in that basic sort of, things that you probably should be writing down is the era that a book was written in. Again, to understand where this book kind of falls into the development of Islam and the history and the legacy of the idea of writing books to serve the deen of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. And you might even have one other point that you can add on, but that would probably be connected to the teacher, which is, what's your purpose of learning this book? Now, that doesn't mean, and that last point is probably something I want to hold on here, because I feel that was really important for me, and that was probably one of the most life-changing advices I ever received, which is to identify a very clear purpose and objective in your learning. That purpose is quite probably something not you'll be able to identify individually. And so say you grab the book in fiqh, why am I reading it? Fiqh is fiqh, right? You just want the ahkam, which is almost like this generic sort of mindset and a purpose behind the learning. But fiqh also has marahil, it has stages, and your teacher will be able to tell you the stage you're at and what you should be doing with that book. And so, for example, the first stage might be taqasim and ta'arif, right? You just need to learn you need to almost like develop a roadmap, and sort of like just the framework of that science. And that then leads into the point of the index. So with the index, you start to see, what does a book consist of? And you can almost and if you feel really sort of creative with it, just get like an A4 piece of paper and just try and break it all down and see all the topics that are studied in that book, or included and embedded in the book, how they fit into the structure of that science. And you might as well, as you go through it, especially in the early stage, you'll focus on ta'rifat as well. And you might add on to that roadmap as well, definitions, right? This word means this, that word means that. And then the details of that definition, the breakdown, what it consists of, what it doesn't consist of, jami' mani', and, the whole story of the concept of ta'rif in Islam, you'll get to individually with every lesson. But I would say that's probably a beginner's sort of journey, with the exception of, the whole sort of the breakdown of the book in a sense, because that's a journey that you're going to go on. But I'd say the first things you probably should jot down is just those three things. And if it's part of a muqarrar, then also write down what's your purpose of learning this. And that purpose, like I said, will shift as well. So the next time you reread the book, you're going to read it from another lens, right? And then you can say the qira'ah thaniya. My second reading of this book, I was focusing on that. My third reading of this book, I was focused on that. And so the purpose of the book shifts. But that first reading of the book, you are focused on that, and almost like that leaves you with the tabi'. It's like the imprint of what that book was about for you. And again, to take it back to the initial point I was making, which is that part of a maktabah is not just a set of books that are put up on a bookshelf. It's your personal identity. It shows your personal growth, your personal transformation. And the more structured and principled you are with that learning, the more growth you'll get out of it. So I think those key questions were very important for me. And subhanAllah, again, I didn't know about them all the way till I think towards the end of the Mahdi's, where, people kind of say, look, you need to know the name of the book. You can't just grab anything, right? And subhanAllah, as well, in later years, you hear of really funny stories. You hear stories of an individual that is looking for a book that bears a certain name amongst Ahl Sunnah. And he'll hear of a book somewhere, shares a similar name or even the same name, that, a whole different, sort of like a aqeedah and whatever, and goes and purchases it. And then he ends up with a Rafidi tafsir book in his house, and he's thinking it's and the mess that could come from that. And so I would say this is a very primitive and a very basic maybe way of exploring, how to build that connection with your first book.
I remember that there used to be some teachers in exams, and they used to ask the first question, who's the author of this book you've studied for the last 14 weeks? And the number of people who couldn't answer the question was very surprising. You have a class of students who work hard and they've studied, and the number of people who've studied this book for 14 weeks and couldn't name the author of the book. And then people started writing, like sort of, the standard answer. So it must be Sheikh Islam ibn Taymiyyah, Qayyim. Who else could have wrote the book? And that for me also, it does show how important it is to get those basics right. So this student has now picked up a book. They've chosen what is recommended for them. Just talking about the taba'at, and what do you look for in a taba'at generally? Like in a print of a book, what makes it good or not good? Because I mean, it's become very commercialized. Is it the quality of the text? Is it the quality of the additions on the the ta'liqat, or the tahqiq at the bottom? What makes a book print good for you?
SubhanAllah.
Is it yellow pages?
Yellow pages, yeah. But the whole concept of like tahqiq is like a science of its own, right? And it's very difficult. Like I'm sure like seasoned scholars today struggle with the concept of like doing their own tahqiq for maybe makhtuta that they have. And so you as a beginner student knowledge, trying to get your head around maybe the idea of the different taba'at of kutub and all the rest of it may not be the best use of your time. But again, I think the concept of taqleed would resolve a lot of this. And I think the key things that, you often hear anyway, and you could summarize it to mainly just two things really, is number one, the adad of the makhtutat al-mu'tamada, the number of like the manuscripts that they built the tahqiq on, right, the verification of the text. The more the manuscripts were, usually the better, usually the more gaps that were filled, usually the more additional sort of like text that you have and so on. And I think the other lens would probably be as well, maybe the manhajiyya for tahqiq. So if, again, this is where one of the things you could develop is, as a beginner sort of a person that's reading books, is knowing, because like you said, like just as you get like giants amongst scholars and people who really reach like really high levels, tahqiq is a science of its own. And there are people that are really good at it. And just by knowing, those type of names that, you'll often hear students citing, is a game changer itself. And so there are books where, if you see a tahqiq of like a person, you just go with that. And sometimes they're not going to be like a muhaqqiq for everything, but they might be like really good in like, for example, Hanbali books, or Shafi'i books, or even maybe Aqidah works, or maybe, a hadith, and with that, inshallah ta'ala, things are just going to go really smooth. But it's, the whole idea of makhtutat and just trying to like discover like the best nuskha and everything. I know people that probably think it's a bit of a waste of time. But wallahi, subhanallah, like it really does, especially in like the later sort of like somebody reading Fath al-Bari, for example, the meaning of the nas is hugely impactful. But as a beginner, I can't really see it, especially if you're talking about like smaller books, right? Because the thing about the smaller books, commonly what tends to happen is they tend to be like almost like a mukhtasar of another book. They tend to be almost like, they're sort of summarized from another book. And because of that, and especially if we know the journey that this book has been through, it's very difficult to assume that there are gaps within that small text that we don't know what the Sheikh meant, or like the word, the exact word that was used or whatever, especially if it's those mutun that are mu'tamada, where you get all these shuruhat on and all these different things, right? That maybe students were memorizing across, centuries. It's, you got all these ijazat and everything built on them. They quite often, every word within a matan like that is very well known and clear, and everybody would have access to. And so I would say the whole concept of taba'at is just Leave it to the more like it's one of those things where maybe it benefits somebody that's Allah barak like yourself, that's going like has gone above that marhala where you're kind of just focusing on that initial matan and so on. But like your first book, don't even worry about matan. Just say to the Sheikh, what tab'a should I get?
And follow
it. Just grab that and just follow that.
I think even the issue of publishing houses, the people who print the books do become known for either certain fields or even a certain quality is associated with some of them. So even that, as it becomes a general guide, you tend to realize that some publishing houses, when you find the book from there and you open it, it's going to have saqt in it, it's going to have things missing. And then others you become a bit more trusting in and say like, that I've got a lot of books from these, generally they've produced a good quality of book. But it is confusing to students because people hear about, it's one of those things you hear about from the first day.
Yeah.
And if we were talking about, I'd quite like to do this idea with you in fiqh. Let's just take al-fiqh al-hanbali and let's talk about these 4 books or whatever it might be, because inshallah we're hoping that you're going to be teaching some of these books for us with al-Madrasa al-Umariyya inshallah ta'ala.
Just 20 seconds until your video continues. That's enough time to ask yourself, are you investing in your growth? AMAU Academy gives you structured Islamic studies, Arabic, and self-development courses all at your own pace. Don't miss out. Begin your journey today at amauacademy.com.
So if we talk about al-fiqh al-hanbali and we talk about that early journey for the student through these books, so what books are they reading and why? Just as an overview, like just to give an example for what you said about there's a teacher who says you're reading this book and your niyyah for reading this book is this. So your first one you talked about is taqasim and the idea of what is this entire topic about? So just take me through an example if you can.
So an example for me for that would be Furu' al-Fiqh of Ibn Abdul Hadi. It's a very small but a very structured book. And so it literally almost like, what I did with some of, when I would play around with the text is you kind of like add in these words at the front to kind of give a little bit more meaning to maybe somebody who comes from a more Western sort of paradigm and how they would look at these things. And so you kind of phrase it with how, why, what, where, and you add just like these sort of like defining type of questionative type terms. And it's just very smooth, very brief. It's something that you can probably cover in maybe even, a couple of hours in a very sort of like just a journey perspective. Takes you from the very beginning of fiqh all the way to the last chapter. And with that, you develop like that whole roadmap. It doesn't have the definitions. So that's definitely a huge sort of loss at that marhala. But you can definitely, there's a lot of, not so much to be honest, but you get shuruhat. You get tahqiqat and you get shuruhat as well. And you could definitely benefit from those additional sort of like ma'ani that you find in that sharh to kind of add on to your notes. So taqasim, I'll definitely do that. There is also the idea of maybe even there, part of like the study of a book like that where you're just focusing on the framework and the map of fiqh is maybe also exploring the concept of the roadmap and why it exists to begin with. It's almost like the how logical and rational the setup of fiqh is. And that's in all sciences. Like there's a story of why mustalah al-hadith, why it became in that sort of format, right? Why tajweed consists of, that many mabahith. Why nahu is split in that way. And understanding, right, like the almost like its restrictive nature where, Bab al-Tahara can only really consist of that. Like even with all the nawazil that you can think of, it's not going to get to a point in time where you're going to introduce a whole new way of like, making tahara, right? That's never going to happen. And so taqasim, it's almost like, it's so beautiful because it shifts how you view fiqh. So as somebody who may be born and raised in the West, you get to a point where you start to view fiqh in the way that the fuqaha wanted you to see it, not taking the baggage that you've come with and bringing it with you into this madda, right? And so that is very beautiful, and especially if you get somebody who's really good at explaining the whole concept of categorizations and taqasim in that science, it can be amazing and a life changer.
So this person's now got this, they know the structure of fiqh specific to that madhab to a certain extent, even though would you say it's not going to differ immensely, perhaps,
no.
But they still have, like, at this point they're still madhab specific to from the point of view at least of the teacher. Is that, am I thinking right?
Yeah. So 100%. It's not going to be maybe applicable in all aspects to another madhab, but for the most part, right, you're gonna get something that is like a framework that would be suitable to all madhab. And because of that, like for example in the Shafi'i madhab, مثل الغاية والتقريب, as the Somalis love to call it, مختصرة بشجاع, it's one of those books where everybody loves, because it's, you know, if you ask the average sort of youngster, it's a book that just literally tells you this consists of that, and this is 1, 2, 3, and it's all about numbers and categories, and you know, and that's all it is. So it's quite, you could literally just, you know, if you're really creative, like I said, just grab almost like a pen and paper, just create like all these diagrams from it, and it's really beautiful for you to do so.
So now a person moves on to the next. Where are they going next?
So fiqh is very interesting, because fiqh is, the purpose of it, or the primary purpose of it, is obviously and the primary purpose of our existence is وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. We were created for worship. And so with fiqh, obviously that's the first portion, but there's also like an inherent focus on ibadah in general. And so a lot of the primary books in that marhala where it's called Tasawwur al-Mas'ala, but a lot of it tends to be focused on Rub' al-Ibadat. And so that's really nice as well, because with that you get this sort of like focus on whether, you know, your tahara is valid, whether your salah is valid, whether your zakah is valid, whether, you know, and that's the focus in that sort of phase. But you could extend it, and that's probably the longer or the more advanced version of it, which is where you focus on contextualizing fiqh all over, like from all the different chapters, from the beginning of Tahara all the way to Akhir Bab al-Itq, where the focus is, can I almost like see this happening in real life? Can I see this mas'ala, or like, because it's in the fiqh book, it's just going to mention this is a rukun, this is a shart, this is wajib, this is mandoob, right? It just attaches rulings to terms. And so one of the major flaws, and this doesn't mean that's going to happen with every single issue, like maybe 9 times out of 10 of what you're going to read in the book is going to be very straightforward. That from the conditions of ghusl is kada, right? And the arkan or kada and whatever, like they're very straightforward. But you're going to come across a few and you're like, you know, what does this really mean? And so the first stage is almost just take out a very sort of like a very short time from your life, but it's going to be hugely beneficial, where the focus isn't to understand fiqh like from a sort of validity perspective. What's the dalil? What's the illah? What's the argument? What's the counter argument? How can I then make qiyas from this mas'ala? Leave all of that, it will come. But this time is all about, can I sort of like see this happening in real life? And am I able to walk away from this class and apply this lesson that I learned? And so that's a very beautiful phase. It can get boring, because it's a lot of students, as soon as they start fiqh and they grab a book of fiqh, it's almost like they're in a fight and they're in a battle with another madhab, another individual, right? And it's all about al-intisar li al-madhab, and you because of that you can get lost in the stage that you're at. But if you're able to just say, look, everything that's happened in the world, I'm really not going to change anything. The best thing that I can do for myself in this phase is just calm down and grab a book and don't overcomplicate this journey, and just say, look, just get a simple explanation. And that phase, to be honest, I feel like like our culture, the Somali culture, does that really well, which is like where the laqabain system, where you just it's almost like a form of translating. And you just go through the whole book and it's just like, it's really just translated for you in a sense. And the person, even though maybe they don't know any Arabic, but because the teacher kind of like, the way he presents it, it's almost like in a language in a way and with examples of how this occurs that is very suitable to that demographic of people. They almost like they're able to like almost visualize what the discussion is about. And so fiqh, it doesn't become just a text that's in a book, it becomes real life to them.
So in this stage of tasawwur, is the person learning specific examples and rulings attached to them? Like, for example, let's say we talk about a person who's praying sitting down because they can't stand up, or because the person can't make sujood for a particular reason. Are they going into that much detail? Is that in their tasawwur when they talk, or are they literally just understanding what fits in and what doesn't fit in here?
No, it's quite literally that. So that scenario of said individual can't pray standing, like he's seated, right? Is there categories to this issue, number one, in the madhab? So does the madhab differentiate between, that person that does it and this person does it, and, what is the difference? The why the difference, not really, that furuq is not really your concern as of now. It's just understanding the different scenarios and attaching the relevant ruling to each of those circumstances. And so this scenario, one of the best things one of the best ways that you can assess your level of learning in this phase is to just create a million examples from the book. So you say, person A did this. Based upon what you studied, what is the ruling that this madhab associates with, said action? And that's all it is. And you probably just, maybe like it's like a, tick the right box and things like that.
Yeah.
So tasweer al-mas'ala is just literally shifting what the written texts that are like almost like very sort of checklist-like, right? Shurutu salati kada, wajibatu salati kada, fara'id al-salah kada. Like there's all this arkan, that's all it is, right? Shifting that to scenarios and examples, and just shifting it from just a checklist to scenarios that you can just almost like visualize and give a connection to. I always like explaining this scenario as well, that one of the things that's really good about fiqh as well is it gets you to think out the box. And so like you could spend all night, right, revising the shurut that's in a matan. But if you really don't understand it, and especially if you don't understand the previous phase, which is the taqasim, right, categorizations and how they work, you'll get to a point in your reading and your study where you almost feel like you can't really answer certain questions because you don't get like what the purpose of the way the fiqh book's written is. A good example is, so say, I remember there's a teacher who had like these sort of scenario-based exams. And so let's say a student finishes learning like the conditions of wudu. And as you're going through those conditions, you're going to see certain things and you're not going to see certain things. And then the scenario comes with something that is not even included in that checklist. What is the ruling of the person that does wudu like naked? And the person who understands like what the purpose of this checklist is, which is the first scenario, is able to think, hold on, it's not in the list, meaning it's not mu'athir. It shouldn't impact the ruling. So you just simply just take, that wudu is valid, right? But the other person is going to be like, his head's going to be scrambling going, well, do you mean the teacher never taught us this? But you're supposed to know from the fact that it wasn't mentioned that it has no bearing. Right? And in that particular method, and just walk away from that. And so the concept of the checklist is really beautiful, but it's how do you then create like a reality for it outside of the book is a whole different level. And that's where, this period comes in. Now, this period is very interesting because I remember some of the mashayikh actually would say to us, all you have to do is give it 3 months. 3 months and make fiqh like almost like give it a reality in your existence and see how that changes everything. And then obviously the more complicated areas of fiqh will come in as well. But it's such a beautiful experience because like I said, it takes everything from just being a checklist to real life examples and scenarios and attaching rulings to it, and makes it a very sort of like a digestible and an enjoyable subject as well, where you actually feel like you're actually able to deal with your own problems and sort out other people's problems as well.
Amazing. So right now I wanted to touch upon something you were talking about, which is at-ta'liq al-kitab. You're talking about writing. So you're saying on the first level of taqasim, you're writing, like, for example, what, how, where, why, like your little
notes
here and there. In this marhala of tasweer, what kind of notes is the student making? Are they sort of real world examples? Are they sort of like additional, just generally the topic of writing on the book, like how do you approach that?
So the writing of the book, it will vary from person to person. Like the things that, like it's the notes that you take are in reality, and the note-taking system is, because things come to some people more naturally than another person, right? So the things that come to you naturally, and maybe you didn't even need a teacher to explain to you, maybe all the teacher did was to almost like convince you of, that your perception of what you thought this was about was correct. I don't really think it makes much sense for you to start taking notes on that, especially if it's not an elaborate, like there's no detail that he's providing you that you didn't already know. But let's say somebody else, he had a faulty understanding of what that meant. So, because sometimes, for example, languages, tatashabah, you've got a term that's used in the books of fiqh, but to you, it means something else entirely because of maybe your native language, or maybe your perception of the issue was flaws and, it was al-aks, right? All these things happen. This phase, there's not really a lot of detail. Like, you're not talking about like intricate issues so much. So there's not a lot of note taking. It's more almost like I said, the focus point is almost like shifting your mindset from maybe like the Western legal system to the Islamic legal system. Like, how do we as Muslims view the world in a sense? What is purity to us? Is it just like the way you just have a shower in the morning and brush your teeth? Or is there something else? Like, is there an element of spirituality and ta'abbud? And how does that, come to life? That's what the whole book is about. And so that journey in fiqh, where you need to take notes. And I guess where you don't, you shouldn't. But there are areas there where the scholars do identify and say you should take notes. And they're namely like the main one that comes to mind, there are a few, is taqyidun li mutlaq. So you find, for example, kalam ahl al-ilm, for example, they come across a condition or maybe an obligation or this or that the author might have left unrestricted. But the reality is that maybe all of the scholars of Islam, or maybe that particular madhab, doesn't phrase it in that way. They say, مثلا, that what is expected of you as a Muslim is that amount. You're almost supposed to like write down the limitations of that issue. And that's a huge one. And that's a game changer as well, where you're able to do that, because that also kind of helps in your perception of the issue. So if you thought like, this tahara meant this, for example, but the reality was that was all that was expected of you, then that taqeed does change how you visualize and, how you see that reality coming to life.
So a quick question on this, drawing things out on paper and putting these diagrams, do you attach them to the book afterwards? Do you put them into the cover, or do you keep them separately? This is just interesting.
I tend to do it per chapter.
Okay.
So each chapter for me, I like to give a breakdown to it, and then I'll put it at the end of that chapter. Okay. And I feel like exactly like when Ahl Ilm say fasl, for example, it from the ma'ani is mentioned for the usage of term fasl, which is chapter, is that it separates it from the previous one, and so there's no real coherence or correlation. Similarly, it separates it from the chapter that comes afterwards as well. And so it's almost like this chapter, it has a commonality. And if you're able to, so what I would do is, and I didn't really understand this as well up until I got to Magister, who was doing my MA in Medina. I remember the person who probably drove that home the most to us was Sheikh Sulaiman al-Ruhaili. Hafidhahullah, where he always repeats to us in every, like, the thing is, the muqarrar was the Qawaid al-Rajab for the first year, 2 semesters. So 1 semester focused on ibadat, the second semester focused on muamalat. But the key issue that he always tried to remind us of, especially because he really liked the work of Sheikh al-Islam, which is Qa'idat al-Nuraniyah. The way that you can almost approach it is, say you've got a chapter in fiqh, you identify the almost like the premise that chapter is built upon, which is, it almost becomes a dhabit, right? So you come to maybe like Babul Aniyah, right? The chapter on utensils. So it's almost like the question then becomes, what's the premise that this chapter is built upon? And it's almost saying all utensils are permissible for you to use, permissible to sell, except for. And so it's almost like the premise is al-aslu al-hill or al-aslu al-tahara, for example, and then everything else that you study in that chapter is where that sort of, there's the exemption to that principle, right? That's what the dhabit is. So if you're able to draw it out, it's almost like writing the premise and then writing all the exceptions to it down in the madhab, and maybe exploring the conditions for some of them and things like that. And if you're able to do it with every chapter, you tend to have a more clear framework and a more clear sort of a breakdown and a roadmap of what the book and what the madhab is about.
Beautiful. Amazing. So now we're going to go from that مرحلة التصوير, تصوير المسائل. Now we're going to go into something a bit more. Where's the next step? This is just to give the student a practical example of reading books with different intentions.
So the next stage would actually be dalil. So it's to study fiqh and everything that you've learned, and as you can see, it accumulates. And so from taqasim and understanding the framework of fiqh, you got to almost like being able to visualize fiqh and see it, like how it plays out in real life. And then you get to the whole idea of evidences. I think the key thing that concerns us when it comes to evidences that I think a lot of people make a mistake in is, say your teacher doesn't mention to you, right, in this book that you're learning, an evidence in the beginning of your journey in fiqh. The understanding what the vision is and understanding the process, right, and where you're going and where the study of evidence fits in your trajectory of fiqh, you start to realize that a lot of evidences you're not going to understand because you're not at a level to understand them. It's almost like a third tier level, the exploration of evidences. And so one of the bad things, unfortunately, I feel like a lot of young sort of طلاب العلم might normalize as statements is, "Akhi, there's no evidence for this issue." And how do you tasawwur like an imam, like Abu Hanifa, or Malik, or Shafi'i, or Imam Ahmed, and their students, right? And all those scholars, like you as a miskeen, like just starting your journey in fiqh, you've got this concern for dalil, but they didn't care. They just said, Muslims should just be doing this ta'abbudan lillah, and we don't really care why, what the evidence behind this is, or like what substantiates this sort of like practice as a Muslim. And like having a husn al-dhan is really important. And sometimes I think, and again, this would probably be an area where I would say I feel like things have gotten better. There was a time, especially if you're battling in that landscape of, should I even pick up a madhab, or should I just be Ahl Hadith, or whatever else is out there. You can sometimes say to yourself, I don't really, I need something to convince me. And once you don't see, the nature of evidences in the early parts of your talib al-ilm, because of, having chosen a madhab and having chosen this way of exploring fiqh, not to say there isn't another way of learning fiqh entirely, that you can almost like sort of, I would say, it weakens your morale, and you kind of feel like it's a system that's not really meant to focus on evidences and so on. Not understanding that the way the framework of learning fiqh through a madhab works is it's a much later sort of concept rather than an earlier one.
I think here also there's two things that come into my mind. The first is that we sometimes have difficulties because of the age at which we start studying. If you actually imagine applying that methodology to someone who starts studying at a reasonably young age, there's a lot less questions raised because a child has limited ability to reason and understand the complexities. And that's why when you're teaching a child and you're teaching them that, this is how you pray, this is how you make wudu, and this is how you pay zakah, and without any kind of discussion around why and the evidences for it, the issue is when we come to being adults, our understanding is at a level where, from a pure understanding perspective, we think, well, I can understand. I want to understand why, and I want to understand what's the reason behind it. I want to understand the evidence behind it. Whereas the difficulty is trusting the process, and I think a lot of talib al-ilm, we keep focusing and telling the students, you have to trust the process. The idea that there's a reason why you learn it like this and like this and like this. The other thing that I think is really important is the students understand that the dalil by itself isn't itself a dalil on its own until you have, for example, that at least you understand wajhul istidlal. What is this evidence being used for? And people give funny examples. Like if I were to write, for example, فَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. There's an ayah from the Qur'an, no doubt. Like, what am I using this ayah for? How am I using this ayah as an evidence for what? So the fact that I can quote an ayah or I can quote a hadith itself doesn't help unless I can show why.
Exactly. Imagine thinking that the ayah shows the permissibility of eating the meat of camels.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah.
So it is really important for a person to understand, to trust the process. True. So here now at this stage, they're understanding the dalil, but they're understanding it, am I right in thinking, from a one-sided sort of perspective?
True. Yeah.
From the purpose of the perspective of the madhab or the teacher's tarjihat even within the madhab here.
Yeah. So the key to unlocking this phase is actually understanding what forms a dalil in Islam to begin with. So there are obviously things that all Muslims agree upon. Like the Qur'an is a dalil. The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is a dalil. You're going to have discussions on certain types of ijma', for example, qiyas and this discussion, right? Then you get to what is referred to as the second tier or layer or level of adilla, which is al-adilla al-mukhtalaf fiha. Evidence, secondary evidences that are debated over its validity or how it's used and so on. So if you have this mindset of Qur'an and Sunnah, but then the madhab or the imam that you're following, he has a wider spectrum of what is allowed as a form of evidence, what he admits, right, as a form of evidences into al-Islam, you're going to get into a state where you see a line, and to a person that understands that this is an evidence and he understands like the why it becomes an evidence, and for you as a person, you're thinking, well, where's the ayah? Where's the hadith? There's going to be a slight sort of misunderstanding there. And so by this phase, there is a level of like expectancy that you've at least studied a basic level of usul. So there's a whole question about what comes first, right? Usul or fiqh. And the khilaf amongst the scholars of Islam is well known and studied from the muqaddimat or in the madkhal of ilm usul. But this is a phase where you can't really cross into without having secured a certain level of usul. So understanding, and you don't have to understand, for example, qawaid usuliyah so much, but you do need to understand what evidences are. And with that, you enter into the discussion on adillah and adillat al-madhab as well.
So at this stage, what's the student writing down now? Like, what is there? Because before it was easier for people to understand. I'm trying to map out where this science goes. I'm trying to apply this to real world situations. Now I'm getting evidences in here.
I think the core stage that you actually get in this sort of marhala is you start to get into a level of like, the point evidence explain. So the point you already know, which is the ruling, and you're able to visualize it and all the rest of it. You've got the evidence, which is, what's in front of you. And at this level as well, you start to understand there are books that are like mutakhassisa, right? That literally are written for adillat al-aqwal and adillat al-madhahib. So they just focus on the evidences of the different madhahib that exist. Now, what your fiqh would probably allow you in this phase is like a basic sort of connection, not a complicated one. Because being able to explain things, you get two levels to it, or two tiers to it. There is the tier where there is like a basic explanation or just a simple link that exists between the evidence and the explanation, right? That you can do. And that most sort of like students at this phase or the beginning phase they can do. But the more in-depth that explanation becomes, because sometimes what you tend to get is understanding the evidence is built on another premise. And then through that premise, or even a second premise or a third premise, along with that hadith, you link it all together through a qaida, and then that collectively formulates one evidence. That is a bit more detailed and a little bit more complex, and that's probably explored in that realm of takhrij a little bit more than you would actually get in like that basic level of learning fiqh on its own. So here the point is dalil, point, evidence, explain, and probably most likely a simple explanation. Most of the books in your chosen madhab will show that anyway. You might just need a little bit more detail from a sheikh, again, explaining certain concepts and so on. And you start to see the link between usul and fiqh in this phase as well.
And then the person goes on from there. Where are they?
The last stage is actually where everything interlinks. So that's where you almost like, you're expected to almost have like the psyche of like the ulama of the madhab. Like, what's the illah? What's the underlying reasoning why this ruling came about according to chosen madhab, right? And you're able to almost like, from that illah, you're able to make qiyas, for example. You're able to apply it to contemporary issues and all the rest of it. So that level allows you to get into fiqh al-nawazil now. Because that stage, which is at-ta'leel, marhalat at-ta'leel, the focus isn't so much on establishing yourself. That is when you learn to expand. So the focus there is, how do you then apply fiqh to your locality and whereabouts and the issues that you interact with day to day, or Muslims around you that you kind of understand in the level of detail. And so it's almost like understanding the underpinnings of all that you've studied so far, and then seeing that connection that may exist with, said issue in your locality and society, and be able to establish that link and then trying to connect between them. But it's also an extension of the adillah and takhrij and exploring the more complex study of the aqwal and the adillah as well.
So in this section, what's the role of the books of, let's say, Fatawa? If you're talking about how the ulama gave fatwa on issues that were presented to them, qadiman wa hadithan. Yani.
So the difference between kutub al-fatawa and kutub al-ahkam and fiqh and so on is that the fatwa changes, whereas ahkam are generally speaking thabita. But part of understanding the fact that the ahkam are there to stay, in a sense, is also understanding that those rulings may be built upon things that may vary from time to time. And so if you were to see, for example, in the sort of like the underlying reason why the madhab holds that this practice should be done, and you start to see l'urf nas, for example, because the customs of people, you should automatically be thinking customs change. That my customs in maybe like London 2025 is going to differ greatly to the 4th century Baghdad. And you should be able to automatically think, so if that's a custom over there, what's my custom here? But with a fatwa, you already start to see the changing of these ahkam anyway. And so you almost, you're going to have, like, and this is the next marhala, which is like the kutub that are almost known as like tahil al-futya and so on. There is an element of exploring issues that maybe the mutaqaddimin didn't really state. You're going to have ikhtilaf al-ahkam in certain issues, depending on, again, where the illah, what was the illah, was it there, was it not, what was the illah to begin with. Maybe even the scholars of the madhab might vary in that. Might be illah murakkabah. One scholar considers a half of the reasoning, while another scholar considers like a multitude and a compilation of reasonings that all need to be met for this ruling to be established. So the concept of a fatwa is more like applying it and seeing its application throughout the different stages of our history, the history of Islam. But in this stage, it's almost like focusing on all those rulings that you've already had, that you've spent all this time studying. You're not talking about bringing in a whole different realm of new issues. We're still focusing on those original issues, but now just focusing on the details to them and the underlying reasons, which then becomes the gateway to this next stage, which is fatwa and all the rest of it.
So I want to bring it back to books.
Yeah.
So this was all an example. The different books the student is getting at each stage. So in the beginning, it's a very small, very, very simple, very small book. Maybe it doesn't even have a sharh, or maybe it has just like a hashia or something like that. It has just some points in the margin. The student then goes to the next stage. They've got a matan. Maybe that matan has shuruhat. They maybe in terms of the issue of tasawwur al-mas'ala. As they're going through, are we expanding the number of books in the bookshelf here, like more than just one, like in a sort of a, not just a linear fashion?
So that's actually a very good point. And I guess people vary. And but it is possible, and it does work, where you're able to do mutala'a of maybe, like, say for example, in your first stage of learning a book, you would focus on the matan only. Then the next stage, for example, where you start to get into like taswir al-mas'ala, you introduce one sharh, for example. But as you go on, you start to have the ability to take on more extracurricular activities, so you can expand. But that might not be possible in that first stage, because expanding on what? Like, you don't even know what you're reading. There is no side reading if the core issues aren't even clear to you. You don't even understand how it fits in and so on. And so again, it's like maybe that first stage is just focusing on what the teacher says. And that then becomes the miftah that then opens all of this for you. But as time goes on, yeah, you can do that. You can start to pick up multiple books, and it's probably in your best interest to do so. But then again, you do find other people that would just say, stick to one sharh. Grab one sharh.
In a linear fashion, so it's like one.
And it might be the best thing for you as well, because sometimes it's the multitude of books can be distracting. So instead of focusing on that purpose that you had, like if you've got like one book or one system or one way of doing things that was purpose built, and the structure and the principle and the approach helps you develop, and you're actually seeing real transformation with yourself, then don't change. But for another person, it might be that the other lens helps them to see things more clearer, right? And that helps them as well, because obviously sometimes the phraseology, like the phrasing of the book, the second book might phrase things differently, which then gives you a more clearer understanding of what it was. It's like if you know this thing they've got in front of us, right? If you're looking at it from this direction, you're only seeing it from this direction. But if I start to describe it from all of its angles, you get a clearer perception of it, right? You might need that. And different books can offer that. But that's not always the case.
Beautiful. So I just wanted to talk now, as we sort of bring this discussion to a close, about maraji', about having books that are there for reference. So during this time, we gave fiqh as an example. And this example could be applied, I wanted to make it clear that it could be applied to any science of the sciences of Islam. You have your stages of learning, your books in each stage, your recommended sharh in each stage, your teacher recommends you a book and a print and whatever it might be, and you're going through that process, and you're trusting in Allah, and you're trusting in the process of learning as you're going through, that you know that there'll be things that are delayed, but you'll get there in the end. Now, there are some books that during this process you want to have for reference. In terms of fiqh, what does that look like?
So just a general book that you want to keep as a reference would probably be the books that you would rely on research. So Maraji', they're very interesting because say you wanted to use a book as a Bahth al-Ilmi to do academic research, for example. Academic research will not limit you to a certain set of book or a certain type of book. Like all of these stages that we described, there are books in there that are very important. But the key difference is that, like say for example, you chose a sharh of a mu'asir, of a contemporary scholar, say Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, for a certain phase of your study. Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen is a very sort of like a unique personality in this day and age because of the way he taught fiqh. He is sometimes used as a form of he is sort of incorporated into research as well because of the weight that he carries both in the madhab and outside of the madhab and in nawazil and everything else. But say you had an average sort of Hanbali instructor and teacher who has an explanation of a matan, right? That book you may not be able to quote for academic research. So you start to have to think at a certain phase of your life. That was very beautiful for you to have benefited from that. And, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward, those mashayikh that, gave us the access to books, from the contemporary sort of scholars and so on. But you get to a certain phase of doing research, and let's say you're looking for a ta'rif عند الحنابلة لهذه الكلمة أو لمفردات معينة, certain terminologies, defining them. You can't define something, right? That you're saying this definition or this understanding of this issue is been with the madhab from the very beginning. You can't then quote somebody who's still alive today. That wouldn't work. So you have to be able to trace it back. And so each of those stages, there are books that are sort of considered to be the benchmark and almost the goal and that are often quoted in each of those stages. You might have to go back and purchase them as well to be able to do good quality research. Maybe even sometimes what you thought you understood, you're going to find that scholar from the contemporary scholars, he gave you almost a dumbed down definition. And subhanAllah, how many of these shuruhat that you might have on your bookshelf, you're going to outgrow them at a certain point in time. It's what's those series called IT for Dummies and whatever else, right? A lot of these shuruhat are kind of like that. And then there comes a point in time where you're going to have to read real works. You're going to have to go back centuries, and then you're going to see, hold on, I don't know how to read a book like this. Because my whole life I've been focusing on sharh mukhtasar of a contemporary scholar, a language that's very similar to the Arabic that I learned in a ma'had. And now there's a bit of a gap between the book that I need to read from to be able to do proper work and proper sort of research, the nature of how things are written, how things are described, and the use of language, and between what I'm used to. It's a bit of a gap. So you then have to learn to bridge between that and develop the skills to be able to read that as well. So each of those marahil has kutub as well, books that are used as reference and maraja and so on. But you might not make the choice at the beginning to buy them. If you make the tough call of saying, I'm not going to read from a mu'asir, I'm going to choose a difficult book, it's one of those things where it's delayed gratification. You're going to feel the pain of it and the difficulty of it now. Meaning that because of the book that you chose in that early stages of your talib al-ilm, you're going to feel like everybody else is moving forward, but I'm not. But at the end, al-aqibah sayakunu lak. You're going to feel at the end of it that you've got access to all of these kutub and the turath al-ilmi, and you're able to read from all of these classical scholars, Ibn Qudama and before, very easily. Whilst maybe people at your level at that time, they're going to start reading from Sheikh al-Islam, fama ba'd. And there's going to be a massive gap between you.
Beautiful. Sheikh, I really appreciate it. Well, it was really beneficial. And I think these discussions, we started somewhere, we went down a road of these examples, but I think that these are some of the things that a lot of people don't hear. Or maybe they hear, sometimes we talk about AMAU fills a space where a lot of people don't have access to these jami'at, these mashayikh. And AMAU fills a certain gap for people in that regard. And I think that sometimes you ask yourself, what are some of the things that are missing? And these type of discussions often get missed out because you have people who are watching videos, who are taking courses, but they sometimes ask, but like, I don't understand, like, what's this journey for me? And where do these books fit in? And how do I access them? The last thing I wanted to cover, and it's absolutely the last thing I want to discuss, is building a reading habit, because I think all of us agree the importance of reading. And we were talking earlier about this idea of building a reading habit. We've talked about, a lot of our discussion here has been about reading your curriculum, because we've been talking about curriculum-based learning stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. There's a certain role for qira'ah hurra, free reading, just picking up a book and opening it up. But how does a person develop a reading habit, and what are some of the tips that you would say are really important for someone who wants to develop a good habit of reading?
I think I'm actually the worst person to ask, because like, I feel a lot of my reading was actually forced. You go through the Jamia, you go through a system, Magister, it kind of forces you to read something very specific. And I think outside of that, until today, I do struggle a lot to read things just for myself. Like there's usually a purpose. And I think you'd agree with me. Sometimes, like, the purpose of preparing a class, like outside of maybe all the classes that you do, how much of personal growth, like strengthening your iman, strengthening your connection with the book of Allah, tafsir, and understanding the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, shuruh al-hadith, you actually give quality time to. And I would actually say for myself, not a lot. I think a lot of it is very focused on the system that just got me to where I am, and it just kind of tells me you have to read this and you have to study that, and that's most of the choices that I've made throughout my journey. But I think away from a curriculum, it's again going back to the whole concept of niyat al-qira'ah, like just asking yourself, what is your intention? And so from intention is, to reach a point in knowledge where you're actually able to benefit yourself, raf'ul jahli an nafsik, and also benefit your community as well. And the key to that is structured principle learning, curriculums. Because akhi, fawda, just this chaotic line of just reading whatever you want, it's not going to get you there. And you might even harm yourself and harm other Muslims in the process of that. So structured learning is so important, and curriculums, play a vital role to that, as well as, all the other types of maybe additional sort of readings that your teacher might encourage you to do. So
here, this is interesting, is the idea of semi-structured. So it's not curriculum based, but reading with a purpose. So instead of picking a random book from the shelf, a person says, for example, I really want to look at either a mawdu' or either a person. For example, I really want to delve into, let's say, the works of Ibn al-Qayyim, for example, Ibn al-Rajab. We did recently Ibn al-Rajab series. Ibn al-Rajab's Majmu' Rasail, I've got a copy of it. I really want to delve into this. And that itself has a curriculum to it, right? It's not also random of like, pick any risala you want. There's a way of, we talked about a muqaddimah to reading Kutub Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. I remember talking to you about this. The idea of understanding what the Sheikh was going through in each phase of his life, and what his purposes of writing were, and how his writing developed, and then which areas you explore first and which are the longer works. So that's sort of a semi-structured, semi-curricular, but outside of maybe a curriculum in terms of maybe like fiqh or usul, but into something more like sort of semi-structured reading with a purpose. Yeah, no, 100%. But even there, subhanAllah, Ustadhi, you find that the maqsud or the niyyah is still a vital part. Because if for example, the whole Sheikh al-Islam, right? The question that you often get, like a lot of, say if they're from a non-sort of conventional Salafi, Sunni type background, the question that you often get is, why that sort of focus on Sheikh al-Islam? What does he bring that,
all those scholars from all those, and لم يخلو عصر من العصور بالعلماء, right? Like there was not an era in a time in our history as Muslims that there wasn't a scholar that did something beneficial for Islam and the Muslims, and quite many of them left behind such great works. But you find like there's this emphasis on certain books. And I think if you're able to connect and explain to the people what the purpose of reading that particular set of books over, say another scholar, it creates like a great benefit. So with, like for example, Sheikh al-Islam is a very interesting personality, both from, for myself, for example, and the students of Usul, because he serves a very beneficial purpose that the Jami'ah would encourage us with. But also outside of that, him and Ibn al-Qayyim and even Ibn Rajab, you almost get like this khulasa of what you see is scattered across the works of like so many scholars in what is considered to be the approach of the Salaf in various different chapters, whether it's mu'taqad and suluk, and almost like bringing this tajdeed and islah, right? A revival of the understanding of the early generation of Muslims to all of these different chapters, and giving a more sort of precise way of living life. And this is something that even today we'll need. Like so often we find that our perception of things are like, they are changed, and it's almost like we're a product of our environment. So our environment shapes our minds to maybe understanding, for example, fame and personal branding and these issues, right, in a certain way. But the early generation Muslims never viewed it like that. And so from the works of Sheikh al-Islam, it's almost like a form of like rewiring your brain to how the Muslims of the early generation Muslims viewed life in this world, in credo matters, in suluk, in fiqh, all the rest of it. And that's a beautiful maqsad. And for us, usul more specifically, it's almost like removing those elements of usul where there's like almost like this philosophy from non-Muslim elements that was introduced, and getting them out of this science so that it remains upon that purity that the Sahaba knew, and the Tabi'een and early generation Muslims. And all of that, it gives like a qima ilmiyyah, what is referred to as a sort of like a knowledge-based value. And so even that qira'ah al-hurra, you kind of, if you're to focus on a personality, I did takhrij al-furu' al-usul in my masters. And it was focused on a personality, which was Ibn al-Banna al-Hanbali, died in the year 471 from the Hijrah, and he was from the greatest of the students of Qadi Abi Ya'la from the Hanabila. And part of it is you kind of have to, before you even pick a personality and you focus and dedicate 4 years of your life to studying that person, is what am I gaining from this? What was he known for? What value would he give me after this journey? How different would my life look in 4 years if I'm gonna, dedicate all this time to reading all of his works? And there's a lot that you gain from Shaykh al-Islam, but I don't think the motivation to do something like that is gonna be there unless you actually understand how enriching and how beneficial and how strengthening of your iman and developing yourself spiritually, and even the rewiring of your brain to almost like make it towards or to turn it towards a more refined understanding of Islam, which is the orthodox Islam of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, and how they understood the realities of this life. If that goal is there, alhamdulillah. But sometimes we just like, there's this culture that develops, and we kind of just feel like everybody's doing it and we have to do it as well. And then once we don't actually understand what's happening here, we kind of feel like because sometimes reading the works of Ibn al-Qayyim is all of it. It's a mashru', it's a project. How many hours will you be dedicating to that? And so you kind of have to think, is my dafi', is my motivation strong enough to get me through the end of that?
Beautiful. Sheikh Abu Bakr, Jazakallahu khairan wa barakallahu feekum. We benefited a lot. The students are going to see you teaching, inshallah ta'ala. You're finishing off Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, and inshallah we're very much hoping that they're going to be seeing you teaching bi'idhnillahi ta'ala within the AMAU Academy, inshallah. So Sheikh, Jazakallah khairan for sharing all of that with us. We really appreciated it. And we leave it there. We, inshallah ta'ala, will be coming back with another sitting very soon, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And I think it was really beneficial, Sheikh. So I really appreciate Jazakallah khairan wa barakallahu feekum. That's what Allah made easy for us to mention. Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. Wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.